Hi everyone, it's Jerry. Let's have a look at a game that was played today, March 31st, at Grenke Chess 2018. Round 1 game. On the white end, Fabiano Caruana. He's paired against Magnus Carlsen. As most of you probably already know, these two will be competing later this year, come November, in the World Chess Championship. That will be a best-of-12 game match. Let's see what words they would have to share with one another on the board before that big event. Caruana opening with d4. Let's see what defense we would have in this game. King's Indian defense. With the knight on c6, black is preparing e5. So white interferes with this, grabbing some space. A new home now needs to be found. b4 it is. That's short-lived. Knight a6. And ideally, if white wants to kill off this knight entirely, you like to construct a3 and b4, taking away the strong square c5, but that would leave white tactically vulnerable, the b4 move. c3 knight would be hanging, and the bishop would be unleashed with knight takes d5. So in the game, it's knight d4. White says, you know what, your knight is strong in the center. I'm going to give him a kick. e5. What does white do here? Couple choices, move the knight or capture the pawn. Computer likes moving the knight to b3, maintaining the strong pawn on d5, and having an eye on knight a5, putting pressure on the queen side. In this game, there's a capture. D takes e6 en passant. Recapture with the pawn. So with this, there's a change in the structure. 2-1 majority, tipping in black's favor. These guys are set back some, but it's still a majority, and it can get rolling and does get rolling. Castles e5. The knight will have to move now. Knight b3 in the game. Computer prefers keeping it in the key 16 squares. Knight b3 is, however, watching over the c5 square. The game follows with c6. This is a multi-purpose move. For one, control d5, and two, provide a new square to a bad piece. Knight on a6 is a bad piece, but in just a few tempi will be morphed into a best piece. There's now a new square on c7, and, well, we'll see where he goes from there. Notice the clock times. About 77 minutes for Caruana, until move 13, e4. This move took nearly a half hour. This is a sign Caruana is not comfortable with his position in these past few decisions, and I believe it's related to the knight on b3. Why am I drawing attention to the knight on b3? Notice the domino effect it has on white's queenside. Knight on b3 means there will be no b4. And if there's no b4, there will be no possibility to fianchetto. So what are you to do as white with the queen bishop? Gotta open his eyes in some way. e4 it is. There's an additional idea behind this move. Let's see what that is. Knight c7, f4. Creating a pawn duo, and white looks to step foot in black's house. Knight e6 follows, f5, knight d4. Let's pause for a moment. This knight has been quite the traveler, and now is a best piece, and unfortunately for white, white can't capture the knight straight away. So it has to kind of work around the knight or put pressure on the d4 square. This is what we have. Knight e3 in the game. Trying to take twice on d4 in this position is not a good idea because of knight g4. Capture, a threat against the queen. This diagonal is vulnerable. Dark squares are under black's control. Possibilities for queen b6 with check, maybe queen to h4. This is little investment for wonderful piece play for black. And this pawn investment is probably just short-lived. Black is very close to simply winning it back. f5 is hit a million times. Short story, capturing twice on d4, no good. You would subject yourself to a lot of dark square pressure In the game, it's bishop e3, preparing to simply recapture on d4 with the bishop. And now we have, at this stage, Carlsen basically dictating play. Caruana is the one who is having to react for these next several moves. So we have knight takes bishop. That is the bad bishop that the knight just took out, but it is still a bishop, and this position is soon to be cracked open for black's bishop pair. White has to recapture. Another capture on f5. White is recapturing with the pawn. It is now passed, but at the same time, white is capturing away from the center, and black now has a central majority, 2-0. This majority gets rolling. d5 hits, cd, rook a to d1, d4, continuing to push the majority. There aren't many ways to get out of this fork. Bishop g5. Black cannot take the knight just yet, so first addresses the pin. Now two knights are under fire. White saves one with check, and only then the other, knight a4, counterpunch. Black hits back, though. The queen is unprotected. Black gives some direction with queen c7. Queens are exchanged. White still has to react here. There is no, there isn't some direct threat right now, but this knight is very close. The knight on a4 is very close to being completely dead. b6, and where do you go, knight? All the squares would be taken away. So white has to be very timely here. Knight a to c5. b6 follows. And now bishop takes knight. So a decision here for black. How do you want to, what kind of minor piece endgame do you want to work with? Do you recapture here and play with two bishops versus two knights? Or do you build up some more in the center? Build up your central pawn mass and play a bishop versus knight position? Black chooses the latter, capturing on c5. So as an example, if bishop takes bishop, we'd have two knights versus two bishops. The knights are ideal. Knight on e4, a very good blockader, and it would help support a kingside pawn advance. Controlling g5 and f6, this would be a strong piece. That can be reinforced as well. So in the game, it's b takes c5, bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and now knight to d2. Computer's preferring some pressure here, trying to provoke c4 and then repositioning the knight. In the game, it's an immediate reposition, knight to d2. Notice black has wonderful harmony, structure. On dark, light square bishop, they work well together. Bishop b7, f6 check, king f8. Have to get a square for the knight. e4 it is. Rook to e8, knight e4. Minors are now gone, and if we just do a piece-by-piece comparison, the white rooks, not very well placed. The black rooks, on the other hand, are ideally placed behind the passed pawns, and they certainly have the flexibility to shift some gears, and we will see this shortly. Targeting b2. Rooks not the best blockaders. The king needs to help out soon. c4 in the game. g4, each side trying to get the majorities rolling, creating passed pawns. Rook to b8, rook takes e5, rook takes b2. Two passers for black, connected. One for white. White still has a lot more work to do before a second passed pawn is created. Rook to d5, c3, and you can't take this pawn on d4. In the game, it's rook to d8. What's the issue with rook takes d4? Well, c2. How are you stopping the pawn? Rook c1 doesn't do it. Rook b1. So what is tried is rook to d8 check. Only move. And now rook h8. So there's the threat of not only winning the pawn, but the rook. And black now has to be very careful. So, for example, if the king goes to e6, there would be a check, and the best that black could do from there is simply return to f7. And if the black king in this position goes to g6, this would be a win for white with rook g8. King here, rook g7. And king here, it's a checkmate in 6. It's, at this point, white could simply forget about this little pawn race and say, you know what are you doing to stop rook h5? White would be winning if the king goes here in this position. So what does Carlsen do? Doubles up on the 7th rank, defends against the skewer, gives up the h7 pawn. This is what we have. Rook takes h7, king g6, a pair of rooks are off, black is down a pawn. But what's most important here is the quality of the pawns. Notice how close the black pawns are to promoting. 5 tempi away from producing 2 queens. White is much further off from having similar. In the game, we have king f2, c2. This is much better than capturing the pawn. Capturing the pawn would allow a discovered check, and the king would get here, which is preferable to what happens in the game. Let's see what this is. c2 forces the rook to blockade. d3, king e3, and rook here, threatening to push through. The king has to now blockade on d2, not d3. So he's further back, and white now has the responsibility to stop this promotion. King takes pawn only at this stage. The material is balanced, so close to promoting, and these guys here are still a long ways off. But given time, white would like to advance him. And this is what we have. h4 right now, king e5, rook to f1. It's very important that white be in a position to shoo the king away as soon as the king defends this pawn. Otherwise, there'll be an idea to get to the e2 square. So, for example, if white doesn't try to reposition the rook here and says, you know what, this guy's passed, let's push him, and let's push him again. Now you're staring at these ideas. In fact, this is a mate on the spot threat. Rook to e2. Big problem for Team White. And it's related to this strong king position on d4. So we have rook to f1, king to d4, and now h5. You don't have to give check just yet, because this rook isn't threatening anything. Rook to e2 is not a threat just yet. h5 in the game. This isn't one of those, well, I have 2 passers, they're both on the same rank, let's flip a coin and we'll move one of them. No. If you move the g5 pawn, you're in big trouble, because there's a clear idea that black would have in reply to g5. How do you know that it should be this pawn that advances? Well, notice the promotion squares. Which one is going to promote and give check? H pawn is the winner. This matters, this difference, which pawn promoting to give check, this matters. Let's see why. If in the game g5 is played, the clear path to victory for Team Black is to play to b7, b1, and what is white doing? Capture the rook? I mean, if you capture the rook, it's just a promotion. Going here allows a rook capture, and you're going to get mated. And if you ignore this threat altogether and just push the pawn, rook takes rook, queen without check, and you end up getting mated. The difference here with h5, the move in the game, is if now rook b7, h6, rook b1, here, aha, you don't have time to promote and give mate because you're in check. This position, interestingly enough, would actually be a draw. Even though white has a queen, there would be no way for white to, let's say, win this pawn with check or give some fork to the king and win the rook. Black has a threat of his own at this stage to promote. So, this is the pawn to advance because of this promotion idea with check. With rook e7 in the game, we now have rook f4. This is very important. Rook f2 is simply not a defense here. In the game, it's rook f4, rook f2. The rook would still come in and give check, and you're not stopping both pawns. Rook f4 in the game. King goes back. Notice this is the first time we have this position. The rook now returns, defending this promotion and threatening the pawn. Black king steps up. Rook returns to f4 check, king back to d5, second instance of this exact position. The rook returns to f1, king c4, once more, rook f4, and now if the king goes here, that would be the third time, and that would be a draw by repetition of position. And this is not what we have. So, sending some message, maybe, for this later match in November. I'm here to play ball. King to b3. Carlsen is still trying to press here, and rightly so. Quality of the pawns. This is very dangerous for Team White. Rook b4 in the game. King takes a3. Rook c4. King b3, and rook c8. Let's just pause for a moment. This is move 54. This game is over in 5 moves. This is a very interesting endgame. I'm only scratching the surface with these next couple variations I share with you. But yeah, this is a critical moment in the game. In the game, we have a5. But the star move here, surprisingly enough, is the move... Well, I'll throw it to you. I haven't thrown a pop quiz your way in this video. If you'd like to spot this star move on black's side, feel free to pause the video and work it out. Okay. The best move here, a winning move, is rook to h7. What is this move doing? It freezes both pawns. Neither can now move without the h-pawn dropping. And in the meantime, this extra pawn that black has can now get rolling. Rook h7 was not played in the game, but let's see what would happen if it was. First, suppose white replies with some checks, and then gets back over like this. Now this a-pawn could run. The king could take here, but if the king takes there, there's king b1, and there's not a good way to defend against this pawn from promoting. There could be a couple checks like this, but if you ever capture, the rook would soon be picked up. That's one very quick variation, and the other one is one that Carlsen would have needed to calculate accurately over 10 moves deep, let's say. White moves and black moves. 10 moves, let's just say. So what is this interesting line? Rook h7, star move. He would have had to spot another star move some 10 moves later. Suppose king takes pawn in this position. White could do this, but notice, white's winning a pawn, but at the same time, that pawn was sheltering the king from some checks on the d-file. Black would be able to come over and give check, and now end up winning this pawn race. a5, h6, a4. Can't go here just yet. g5, a3, g6. It's at this point black would have to find another star move. Keep in mind, white is ready to advance with what pawn? Which one would you like to as white advance to, or advance with at this stage? The g pawn, as that would be the one that would promote with check in this case. Black would have the star move. There's only one winning move here for black. The rook basically cannot stop the pawns from successfully getting to the 7th rank, but this additional star move, rook to d8, is the winning move. Some, again, 10 moves later, trying to deflect the rook, rook takes rook, black would promote, and if white just goes here, now we would have a2, because in the end, this is not a threat. The rook is there to stop the promotion with check. Black would be winning this pawn race, but would need to find this star move, and then in the event of a king takes pawn, this later, rook d7 and rook d8 move. Didn't come up with it in the game. a5 instead, and now this one ends in just 5 moves. A check, king takes pawn, the rook gets behind, and black actually has to be a little bit careful. These pawns are really moving fast. It's at this point that black goes ahead and gives multiple checks, and this one ends peacefully, players agreeing to a draw. You can't really try to just keep running with a pawn like this. Just as an example, there's a check. You could even give up the rook. Once these two pawns are on the 6th rank, there's no stopping a successful promotion, and this pawn isn't going to be fast enough to get a queen. This would be a drawn position, but there's no reason to even go for something like that. It's much easier to keep giving checks and keeping the rook around behind this passed pawn. So it ends peacefully here, but certainly a fighting draw. And if this is a preview of what's to come November, I think we're in for a wonderful World Chess Championship match. Anyhow, as usual, feel free to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. Hope you enjoyed it and maybe even took a thing or two away from it. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.